I'm pleased to be representing the philosophy department in these lectures today and next week. I've entitled this time, Connecting Sunday and Monday, What Every Pastor Needs to Know About Work and Economics. And I know we have a lot of undergrads in here who are not headed for the pastoral ministry, so don't despair. There's a lot of this in here that'll be for you as well. Because I think some of this material, particularly on work and vocation, is really important for those of you who are undergrads who are headed for various careers and vocations in the marketplace. In fact, I think this is one of the reasons why Biola is a university today and not a Bible college. That we hold that God calls people to careers and vocations in the marketplace as arenas of service to Christ. And this is one of the reasons why part of the university curriculum is to prepare you to pursue those with excellence, because ultimately it's the Lord Jesus whom you are serving as you go out into the marketplace. But this is also a really important part of seminary education. And those of you that are headed for ministry in the local church or on the mission field, it's really important that you're able to connect meaningfully with the vast majority of people who will be charged to your care, who are men and women who are out there slugging it out in the marketplace week after week and day after day. And God has called you as part of your pastoral ministry to help them meaningfully connect their faith with what goes on in the marketplace. And so part of our curriculum at the seminary level is to help you do a better job with that once you're out and ministering in the local church or whatever the parachurch or mission field or whatever the context for that is. So I look forward to a chance to reflect on some of these things with you over this week and next week. I regularly try and ask my students, and both students, I teach in the business school regularly, and I'm really interested to hear this from business students as well as seminary students. I routinely ask them how people who are working in the marketplace, business professionals, blue-collar workers, how they are perceived in their churches and how they tend to understand their work in the marketplace in relationship to their spiritual life. And I get some really interesting answers to this. In fact, sometimes we tailor this to undergrads in the business school, and we ask them, how are business students perceived across the university here? And sometimes we get some very interesting answers to that, too. Some of the things that my seminary students will say about how business professional folks are perceived in their churches. I had one student who told me a while ago that business people are viewed in her church as pockets to be picked, which I found a kind of an interesting imagery. Though I think it's fair to say that there are lots of people who do get great joy out of providing the funding that it takes to run local churches in the mission field. Churches generally don't generate revenue, they collect it, and need business and professional folks to generate the revenue that it takes to help keep those running. They also suggest that business people are perceived as having gifts that can help administrate the church more effectively. Right? Though sometimes that's a rough transition, because business people sometimes don't quite catch that the local church is not quite the same thing as a corporation. And though it needs to run effectively, they have very different missions. Third, students will say that business people are sometimes recognized for having a unique position in the marketplace that gives them what I call a strategic soapbox for sharing their faith. That is that most business professional folks have relationships with people that they come into contact with regularly in the marketplace who will likely never darken the doors of our churches. And they have an opportunity to be maybe the one open Bible that people in their workplace see. And I always get a kick out of students who lament that they are the only Christian in their particular workplace, as though they wish they had some company and collegiality. And I always look at them with this shocked look on my face and say, you mean God's entrusted that entire place to you? Seriously? And some actually will see the business person as a really critical person for getting the gospel into places around the world that are closed to people who want to come in as missionaries. But I also hear some other things that aren't quite so positive about how people in the marketplace are perceived in their churches. Sometimes students will tell us that business people see themselves as not on the front lines of what God's doing in the world, as though for some reason we get this idea that the locus of what God's doing in the world happens when we gather in the church building, as opposed to when we go out into the world. They'll say something like, people who are working in the marketplace feel like they are doing something less than for God's kingdom than those men and women who are actually earning a paycheck from a church or another Christian organization. Sometimes they'll say things like, well, at best, what I'm doing in the marketplace is just a support to those who are where the real action of God's kingdom is. Now, sometimes I'm around students, Talbot students, who come to school a little bit later in life, and they'll say things like this. They'll say, I left my business to go serve Christ full time. And I give them a look like, are you sure about that? Are you sure that's how you want to say that? Or they'll say, I left my business to go into vocational ministry. And I look at them like, where exactly did you learn the theology that underlies that? Or they'll say things like, I am so excited to be in school, to be preparing for the ministry. And some of them have actually read the book Halftime. You guys may be familiar with that. There are a handful of my colleagues over here on this side who are old enough to appreciate that. Halftime is written by a cable TV executive, Bob Buford, who was the founder of what's called the Leadership Network. And he had reached in his early to mid-40s, he had reached what he called the halftime of his life, where his kids were raised and up and out of the house, and he'd sort of been there, done that in business. And he started to rethink what God might want him to be doing with the second half of his life. And he called that transition, interestingly, a movement from success to significance. And he urged people in the second half of their life to be about kingdom work. And I don't think that's any different than what some of my students will say when they say, I left my business to go serve the Lord full time. I want to ask them, well, what did you think you'd been doing for those years where you thought you were in business? I realized essentially that a lot of my students, and a lot of the business students that I'm in contact with too, have what I would call an underdeveloped theology of work and vocation. And I think it comes out in some unusual ways that I think can really contribute to people who are in the marketplace feeling like they are doing something less than for God's kingdom. And I think theologically, I think as we'll see in a few moments, I think that's a significant problem. And so what I want to try and challenge us with is to talk about the occupations in the local church and the occupations in the marketplace in a way that I think reflects what the Bible teaches about this. So of course, God calls people to the marketplace for a variety of reasons. We would say there are a variety of reasons that I would say have what we call instrumental value. That is, they are a jumping off place to accomplish other things. For example, God calls you to work in the marketplace because you are obligated to support your family and those who are dependent on you. The Bible is very, very clear about that and has some of its strongest language reserved for people who neglect that obligation. The second, the Bible also suggests that we work in order to have the means to express our generosity toward the poor among us. We work also to support the local church and the mission field. We also work, I think, because in the marketplace we do have an opportunity to be salt and light and to represent our faith, to live out our faith for people who will probably never come to our churches. But if that's all that there is to it, if those are the only reasons that God calls people to the marketplace, then it seems to me that we have an impoverished theology of work. Because I think the Bible teaches that work has not only instrumental value, but also intrinsic value, specifically value in service to Christ. Let me spell out a little bit what that means. I love to ask groups of business and professional folks when I have a chance to speak to them. Sometimes I'll go back and give them a little biblical quiz and ask them, when was work actually ordained? Was it ordained in Genesis 2 or in Genesis 3? And I'm often disappointed to see what an ambivalent answer is given to that question. Because although most of my Talbot students, I think, get this right and answer that work was ordained in Genesis 2, lots of business and professional folks live as though work was ordained in Genesis 3. They live as though their work is their penalty. And I suspect that the vast majority of people in our churches, if they won the lottery, they would quit working tomorrow. And there are a lot of people that we minister to in our local churches. I suspect some of you who are undergrads are looking for the fastest, quickest, ethical way to make as much money as you can so you can retire and do something else besides have to work in the marketplace. I have news for you. Work was ordained prior to the entrance of sin, and though it was cursed by sin, work itself is not a curse. In fact, in both of the bookends of paradise, you will be working. Right? Adam and Eve worked, beginning in Genesis 2, to till the garden. Right? God ordained both work and procreation because they couldn't till the garden all by themselves. And when the Lord returns, I hate to break this to you, but you will still be working when the Lord returns. Because when the Bible uses some of the imagery to describe the kingdom being consummated after the Lord returns, they use phrases like they will beat their swords into what? Plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. That the implements of war are being transformed into the implements of productive work. So I'm sorry to break that to you, but when the kingdom is consummated, you will still be working. Right? Now, I'm not sure about the drawing a paycheck part. I haven't quite figured that one out. But work is being redeemed as part of the material creation being restored by the return of Christ. Now, to be more specific, work was ordained in Genesis 1 and 2 primarily as one of the primary means by which human beings were to exercise dominion over creation. In fact, God ordained procreation in addition because the task of dominion was not to be undertaken by Adam and Eve, just the two of them. I think it's fair to say that throughout the process of creation, God embedded certain aspects of his wisdom into creation, that through common grace and general revelation, he's given human beings the tools to continue developing what was embedded into the creation. And the workplace is one of the primary mechanisms by which this dominion mandate is exercised. And though, to be sure, after the entrance of sin, dominion became immeasurably more complicated. In fact, I think you could probably make a case that the primary focus of dominion became alleviating and mitigating the general effects of the entrance of sin. Work continues the development or the unlocking of what God had embedded into creation. Now, finally, theologically, one of the main reasons work has intrinsic value is because that's fundamentally a part of who God is. And fundamentally a part, not the whole, but a part of what it means to be made in his image. That, remember, right out of the chute in Genesis 1, God appears as a worker. At the end of Genesis 1, he's rested from his work. Throughout the Old Testament, God is portrayed as being at work to sustain and maintain his creation. And Jesus, in one of his strongest claims to deity, claimed that on the Sabbath he was still working as my Father is still working today. I think what this suggests is that as a part of being made in God's image, human beings are hardwired for work. It's a part of our spiritual DNA. and that we represent the Creator God as we enter the workplace. Dorothy Sayers, the British author, put it like this, that work is not what one does to live, but the thing one lives to do, the medium in which he or she offers himself or herself to God. This is why sometimes we use the imagery of your work as an altar, the place at which you devote your gifts, and skills, and time, and energy, and talents in service to Christ. Now, it's true that the altar imagery also has a downside to it in that your work can also become an idol with which you become obsessed and at which you worship. And that's clearly not the imagery of that. But it is, I think this imagery does come through in places like Ecclesiastes. This is one of the reasons I think that Solomon in Ecclesiastes can claim that though work is limited and that work is not the thing that gives ultimate meaning to life, it is nonetheless an intrinsically good thing. This is why, for example, Solomon can say in Ecclesiastes 2:24, a person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This too I see is from the hand of God, for without him who can eat or find enjoyment? And likewise in Ecclesiastes 3, he puts it like this, I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. And then finally, in the end of chapter 5, this is what I have observed to be good, that it's appropriate for a person to eat, to drink, and to find satisfaction in their toilsome labor under the sun during the few days of life God has given them, for this is their lot. Now, the New Testament continues this idea of the intrinsic value of work in a passage like Colossians chapter 3. Now, be careful to recognize who this is actually being addressed to, because it's a significant part of it. Colossians 3, Paul puts it like this, beginning in verse 23. Said, in whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. I think they're supplied by parenthesis, in whatever you do, it's the Lord Christ whom you are serving. And now that was addressed not to pastors and missionaries, but it was addressed specifically to slaves. Because in verse 22, it's prefaced by slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything and do it not only when their eye is on you and curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence to the Lord. Okay, now arguably, I think in the first century, slaves did the most mind-numbing, brainless, tedious, grunt work that you can imagine. But yet, Paul affirms here that the work that slaves did for their masters was a part, not the whole, but a part of their service ultimately to Christ. Hey, now, I think to make sure we get this clear, I ask a lot of business folks, tell me about your ministry in the workplace. Tell me about your service to Christ in the marketplace. And they'll say, well, that happens when, I get it, like if I lead a Bible study at lunch in my office, or if, when I get a chance to pray for a coworker, or on that occasion where somebody says, hey, there's just something different about your life, tell me about that. And I realized that the only things that constituted service to Christ in the marketplace were all those things that they were doing when they were not doing their jobs, and actually putting themselves at risk of theft from their employer of time if they did too much of that. And what I think Paul is affirming here is that the very work itself is a part, not the whole, because you have service obligations in lots of other arenas too besides the marketplace. But the work itself that people are doing is a part of their service to Christ. This is why we say, if you walk over to the business school and walk in there, I think they've gotten this right, where that banner that comes down as you walk in, where it says business as ministry. Okay, now, they could have said that a number of different ways, right? They could have said ministry in business, which was, I think, the common understanding. Or they could have said business and ministry, which would have suggested a dichotomy. But I think they got that right, where they see that the very work itself that's done in the marketplace as a part of a person's service to Christ. And see, if you look at the term ministry, the term, the Greek in the New Testament, it's the term diakonia, which is frequently translated service as well as ministry, and sometimes used interchangeably. And that, for example, in Acts chapter 6, the ministry of waiting on tables is described as a diakonia, in the same way that the ministry of preaching and prayer is described as a diakonia. Okay? Now, they were different sets of things that different people were called to because of where God wanted them. But both of those things are called ministry. Both of those, I think the best way to refer to that is they are just different arenas of service to which people are called. And if it's true, it seems to me, if it's true that what people in the marketplace are doing is service to Christ, and is God's work in the world analogous to what pastors are doing as God's work in the local church and missionaries are doing as God's work on the mission field, then it seems to me that what goes on in the marketplace not only is good work to help facilitate all these things that have instrumental value, but also has eternal significance. So that the business person, I think, who understands this theologically, the business person can't say, well, my business is just, if you're a machine tool operator or a construction builder or something like that, it's just drilling holes to put nails in, or, all these things that suggest that it's not particularly significant. But what goes on in the marketplace is an arena of service to Christ, which I think gives it part of its eternal significance. That's why we say in a university setting like this that yes, pastoring is ministry, but accounting is ministry, and filmmaking is ministry, and marketing is ministry, and music is ministry. Then what we mean by that those are various arenas of service to Christ, so that when my students tell me, I left my business to go into full-time ministry, I like to say gently that no, you've actually done nothing of the sort. Because, for one, the fact that whether you're in full-time service of the King or not has nothing to do with where you get a paycheck, right? Because at what point do you enter full-time service for the King? It's at the moment you come to faith, right? And what you do when you change jobs is you change arenas of service. And when a pastor steps down from a pastorate, what do we usually say that constitutes? That they've what? They've left the ministry. Well, they've actually, I think, done nothing of the sort. In fact, if I understand the New Testament correctly, the only way that I'm aware of to leave full-time service for the King is not a pretty sight, right? And that's to defect from the faith. That's the only. It seems to me that's the only way you leave full-time ministry. And so, all of us, if we are followers of Christ, are in full-time service for the King. And where you get a paycheck from is a different set of issues than whether you're in full-time ministry or not. And see, I think the way we talk about this actually makes a big difference in contributing to this sense in many of our churches that business and marketplace people have a feeling like they're doing something less than for God's kingdom. And see, I try never to use the term full-time ministry to refer to any specific occupation. I certainly try not to use that in reference to the pastorate or the mission field. Because what that implies to the person in the marketplace is that they're either in part-time service or not at all. And I think neither of those things are true theologically. Now, we have some interesting traditions, I think, around the university and in some of our churches that I think gives away our theology on this. We have, for example, when we send out short-term missions teams, we do it here, we do it in many of our churches, I think we correctly send them out with prayer and all sorts of support and encouragement and great fanfare. And I know we do this at least twice a year here when short-term teams go out in the summer and go out during interterm. But I wonder, what do we do for our film students who are going to go do internships in the summer at places like NBC and Universal Studios or production companies around the entertainment industry? Arguably, I think, just as significant steps of faith and just as foreign a culture as you may find in some other parts of the world. Or for accounting students who are going to go do internships at the Big 5, 4, 3, however many of those accounting firms are left today. But to go do internships there, because it seems to me, those have some of the same status as some of the short-term mission trips that we send people out to. When we did the last time we did a faculty retreat at Talbot, we invited a group of executives to come be with us for that. And we commissioned them to their full-time ministry in the marketplace. I remember one of those business people was an executive who he held up his iPhone and showed us that the little metal strip that goes around the iPhone 4 and 5 was manufactured by his company. And this was the second company he had taken public, incredibly successful business person. I think when he sold his first company, he was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And I remember as he's talking about his story, he grew up in a pastor's family. And I remember the term he used for it. He said, when I finally realized that God had called me to the marketplace, I felt gypped. Because I felt like I was consigned to do something that was second best for God's kingdom. And it's taken him so long to get over that. But yet it seems to me that God has called him to the marketplace, analogous to the way God's called some of the rest of us to teaching or to pastoring or to the mission field. And that simply is his arena of service to Christ in the work he does, but also in how he represents himself and his faith. I have a dear friend of mine, and I'll close with this, who we talk about these things a lot. And it turned out that some time ago, he and his wife were coming back from vacation, and on the jetway, departing from the airplane, she collapsed, blacked out, and finally regained consciousness, but was sort of in and out of consciousness for a while. They rushed her to a neurologist and found out that she had a tumor about the size of a quarter at the base of her brain that was causing these blackouts. And so through technology that had just been developed called the gamma knife technology, they were able to excise the tumor in a single outpatient surgical procedure. She went home that same day and is, to my knowledge, is totally fine today. And I remember my friend who was reflecting on all of the occupations that had to come together to facilitate his wife's healing. And he was particularly taken with the team or the individual, probably more a team, that had written the imaging software that enabled the neurosurgeon to pinpoint exactly where the tumor was and to get it out with a minimum of damage. And I remember the statement he made. He said, assuming that person's a Christian, He said, I am so glad that the person who wrote that imaging software didn't decide to leave his business to go serve the Lord full time. And I think what he meant by that is that he recognized that in the providence of God, that person was part of a team that helped facilitate the very important task of healing for his wife. And I think he recognized, what Paul affirmed to slaves, and what I think we need to affirm to those of you undergrads who are headed to the marketplace, and for those of you who are pastoring, to affirm to the business, professional, and marketplace folks who are in your churches and in the groups of people to whom God has entrusted to your care, that it is the Lord Christ whom you are serving.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.